January 1945. The winter air over western Germany is sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Snow sits in the ruts left by American armor, already stained dark by oil and mud. The war here feels nearly decided. German resistance is breaking, towns are falling with little fight, and columns of prisoners shuffle west under guard. Inside a command vehicle near the front, a report is placed on a desk. It does not describe a battle. It describes people, men held behind wire, starving, sick, and disappearing as German units retreat. The report is uncertain. Higher headquarters has dismissed similar claims before. No confirmed camp, no authorization to divert forces. The general reading it does not linger. He looks up, voice flat, decisive. We're getting them out. That sentence does not end a conversation. It begins a collision between momentum and conscience, one that can only be understood by stepping back to see how the war reached this moment. By January 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered a strange and volatile phase. The Allied armies were advancing, but not cleanly. The German offensive in the Ardennes, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, had been blunted, yet its shock still lingered. Units were exhausted. Supply lines were stretched thin. Roads were clogged with refugees, wreckage, and retreating enemy columns. The U.S. Third Army had just completed one of the most aggressive operational maneuvers of the war. Pivoting north in freezing conditions, it had relieved the surrounded town of Bastogne in late December 1944. That maneuver reinforced a reputation already firmly attached to its commander: speed, aggression, and an almost ruthless refusal to slow down. Third Army doctrine favored movement. Momentum was protection. Pausing invited disaster. Yet the terrain of western Germany and eastern France told a different story. As American forces pushed forward, they did not just encounter retreating Wehrmacht units. They encountered the infrastructure of a collapsing regime. Rail yards clogged with abandoned cars, villages stripped of young men, columns of civilians forced onto frozen roads under guard, and increasingly reports, fragmented, inconsistent, often dismissed, of detention sites holding prisoners who were not soldiers. At higher Allied headquarters, intelligence officers struggled to keep pace with events on the ground. Information moved slowly. Claims required confirmation. Aerial reconnaissance focused on bridges, rail lines, and troop concentrations, not fenced compounds hidden in forests or repurposed factories. When reports surfaced describing camps or labor enclosures, they were often categorized as temporary holding sites for displaced persons or enemy workers, not formal camps requiring immediate action. There was also a strategic reason for skepticism. The Allied advance relied on relentless pressure. Diverting armored units to investigate unconfirmed reports risked breaking that pressure. Commanders were expected to maintain objectives, not chase rumors. The assumption, dangerous but common, was that whatever horrors existed behind the lines would be dealt with once the war was decisively won. On the ground, however, junior officers and enlisted men were seeing something else. They encountered skeletal figures in striped clothing wandering roads after guards fled. They found makeshift graves near work sites. They listened to stories told in broken English, French, Polish, or Yiddish. Stories of forced labor, beatings, starvation, and death marches as German units withdrew. These encounters rarely fit neatly into reports. Some were written off as exaggeration. Others were delayed by operational priorities. The gap between what was seen and what was officially acknowledged grew wider with each mile advanced. That gap is where tension formed, between the demands of operational warfare and the evidence accumulating at the front. Tension that would soon force a decision no doctrine had fully prepared anyone to make. To understand why reports of a prisoner camp could be denied even in early 1945, it is necessary to understand how the German camp system appeared from the outside, and how little of it was designed to be visible. Not every site was a concentration camp in the formal sense. Many were satellite labor camps, temporary enclosures, or requisitioned factories and farms where prisoners were worked until exhaustion and then moved, abandoned, or left to die as the front shifted.
On the ground, however, junior officers and enlisted men were seeing something else. They encountered skeletal figures in striped clothing wandering roads after guards fled. They found makeshift graves near work sites. They listened to stories told in broken English, French, Polish, or Yiddish, stories of forced labor, beatings, starvation, and death marches as German units withdrew. These encounters rarely fit neatly into reports. Some were written off as exaggeration. Others were delayed by operational priorities. The gap between what was seen and what was officially acknowledged grew wider with each mile advanced. That gap is where tension formed between the demands of operational warfare and the evidence accumulating at the front. Tension that would soon force a decision no doctrine had fully prepared anyone to make. To understand why reports of a prisoner camp could be denied even in early 1945, It is necessary to understand how the German camp system appeared from the outside and how little of it was designed to be visible. Not every site was a concentration camp in the formal sense. Many were satellite labor camps, temporary enclosures, or requisition factories and farms where prisoners were worked until exhaustion and then moved, abandoned, or left to die as the front shifted. By late 1944, the German system was in retreat. Camps were being evacuated hastily. Prisoners were forced onto marches in winter conditions, guarded by units that themselves were short of food, fuel, and discipline. Records were destroyed. Locations changed. Some camps existed only for weeks before dissolving into chaos. From an intelligence perspective, this made confirmation extremely difficult. Allied command structures relied heavily on verified data. Intelligence summaries required corroboration from multiple sources. A single unit's report, even if accurate, could be downgraded if aerial photographs did not support it or if the location lay outside designated operational objectives. In this environment, a camp that did not appear on maps, did not show clear industrial signatures, and was not already known to intelligence officers could simply vanish into paperwork. There was also a legal and logistical dimension. The liberation of prisoners was not a simple act of opening gates. It required medical personnel, food, shelter, and security. Disease was a constant fear. Typhus outbreaks in previous liberated areas had spread rapidly among civilians and soldiers alike. High Command worried that unplanned liberation could cripple frontline units with illness and humanitarian obligations they were not equipped to handle mid-operation. This caution translated into policy. Units were instructed to report discoveries, secure perimeters if possible, and continue advancing unless explicitly ordered otherwise. The priority remained defeating the German army. Humanitarian intervention, while acknowledged as necessary, was treated as a secondary phase of the campaign. For a commander like George S. Patton, this created friction. Patton was not ignorant of policy, but he was deeply skeptical of abstraction. He trusted what his officers saw and what his soldiers encountered. His war diaries show repeated frustration with delays, denials, and what he perceived as excessive caution from higher headquarters. By January 1945, Third Army units were advancing into regions where German control had collapsed unevenly. Some towns surrendered without resistance. Others still enforced orders from a regime that no longer had the power to support them. In that vacuum, camps, official or improvised, were left behind, their existence denied, not out of malice, but out of bureaucratic inertia and fear of distraction. When the report reached Patton's headquarters, it carried all the hallmarks of this problem. Unverified location, no aerial confirmation, no prior intelligence file. From a distance, it was easy to dismiss. From close enough to smell decay, it was impossible. That difference in perspective would soon define the next phase of events. As the issue moved from background noise to an unavoidable confrontation between command authority and moral urgency. The first angle is human, because the war reached its most undeniable clarity there. American soldiers advancing through villages and wooded roads did not find organized resistance. They found people who barely resembled people anymore. Prisoners emerged slowly, unsure whether the uniforms they saw meant rescue or another deception. Many could not speak. Some did not stand. Their bodies showed the mathematics of starvation, bones sharp under skin, eyes too large for their faces, movements reduced to reflex. These encounters were not isolated. They repeated themselves across Third Army's axis of advance. Soldiers wrote home about men who collapsed after taking a few steps. Medics treated wounds caused not by bullets, but by work tools, malnutrition, and cold. These were not battlefield casualties. They were evidence of a system designed to extract labor until nothing remained. For the men who encountered them, the question of whether a camp was confirmed became irrelevant. The suffering was in front of them. The second angle is command, where distance changes perception. At headquarters, war was managed through symbols, arrows on maps, casualty figures, fuel tonnage, timetables. A report of a camp without coordinates precise enough to be plotted competed with requests for ammunition and bridge repair. There was no malice in this. It was the logic of industrial war. Decisions had a scale. Individual tragedies were acknowledged, but rarely allowed to alter operational tempo. Patton's command style disrupted that logic. He believed tempo mattered, but he also believed leadership required moral clarity. His insistence that his army not merely bypass evidence of atrocity put him at odds with superiors who feared chaos, disease, and distraction. Patton did not argue that liberation was easy. He argued that ignoring it was impossible. The third angle is tactical. Diverting forces, even briefly, carried risk. Roads were narrow. German units, though weakened, were still capable of ambush. Medical units were not always close enough to handle mass casualties. Every hour spent investigating meant an hour not spent advancing. Yet the longer the delay, the more likely guards would flee, prisoners would die, or evidence would be destroyed. Tactically, hesitation created its own dangers. In this triangle, human suffering, command caution, and battlefield risk, the situation hardened. Reports became more urgent. Words like possible and unconfirmed gave way to numbers and descriptions that could no longer be softened. What had once been deniable was becoming visible. That visibility forced the issue toward a moment when hesitation would no longer be an option, and the next set of angles would determine how the decision was justified, and by whom. The fourth angle is the enemy's perspective, not as justification, but as context. By early 1945, German control over its camp system was unraveling. Guards were under orders to evacuate prisoners ahead of the Allied advance. But those orders collided with reality. Trains were destroyed. Fuel was gone. Command structures were collapsing. In many places, guards simply abandoned their posts. In others, they forced prisoners onto marches with no destination, leaving bodies along frozen roads. From the German side, these were not strategic decisions. They were acts of desperation in a system already imploding. This collapse created ambiguity. Some camps no longer had guards. Others had been partially evacuated. A site discovered by American troops might not look like a camp in the formal sense. There might be no gate, no signage, no centralized administration, just people, wire, barracks, and silence. That ambiguity fed denial. If it did not resemble the camp's intelligence officers expected, it could be dismissed as something else. The fifth angle is moral, and it is the most uncomfortable. Total war trained commanders to prioritize objectives over individuals. That logic saved lives in the long run by shortening the war, but it also created blind spots. The suffering of prisoners was not caused by Allied inaction, yet Allied hesitation prolonged it. The question was not whether the army caused the atrocity. It was whether it would act once the atrocity was undeniable. For Patton, morality did not mean sentimentality. He did not speak in the language of humanitarianism. His language was duty. An enemy that starved prisoners was not just immoral. It was weak, criminal, and deserving of exposure. To leave prisoners behind was, in his view, to accept the enemy's terms even as they collapsed. The sixth angle is documentation. War crimes required evidence. Camps needed to be recorded, photographed, logged, and secured. That required time, discipline, and authority. Without intervention from senior command, discoveries could vanish into anecdote. Patton understood that liberation without documentation risked becoming rumor. He also understood that documentation without action was meaningless to those still behind wire. These angles converged rapidly. What began as scattered encounters became a pattern too large to ignore. The front was moving, but the evidence was accumulating faster. At some point, a commander had to decide whether the war's momentum would absorb this reality, or whether it would be forced to stop, even briefly, and confront it directly. That decision would not come gradually. It would come in a moment, tied to a specific location, a specific order, and consequences that could no longer be deferred. The turning point arrives not with fanfare, but with confirmation. in mid-January 1945, as Third Army elements press deeper into Western Germany. One report finally refuses to remain abstract. The location is fixed. The descriptions align. Multiple units, approaching from different directions, describe the same site. Barbed wire. Barracks. Prisoners too weak to flee when guards disappear. Graves dug shallow into frozen ground. This time, the report does not stall at division level. It moves upward intact. At 3rd Army headquarters, the operational picture is already crowded. Orders are being issued for river crossings. Fuel allocations are being argued over. Yet this report cuts through because it contains something previous ones lacked: immediacy. The camp is not behind the lines. It is directly in the path of advancing units. Bypassing it would require a conscious decision to leave it behind. Patton's reaction is not recorded as theatrical. There is no speech, no written declaration. What survives in accounts and diaries is a directive tone, short, impatient, final. He does not wait for extended authorization. He orders units to secure the site, prevent any further movement of prisoners, and summon medical support immediately. This is not a deviation from command authority so much as an interpretation of it. Patton does not frame the action as humanitarian relief. He frames it as a military necessity. The camp is a crime scene. It contains enemy victims. Leaving it unsecured risks both loss of life and loss of evidence. In his view, that is unacceptable. The order ripples outward. Units already stretched thin are told to halt briefly. Engineers are redirected. Medics are pulled forward. Officers are instructed to document everything, to photograph, to record testimony, to mark graves. The tempo of the advance slows, not by accident, but by intent. For soldiers approaching the camp, the shift is palpable. This is no longer a rumor encountered on the edge of a road. This is an objective. Weapons are lowered, not because the danger is gone, but because the threat has changed form. The enemy here is absence of food, of care, of time. As gates are approached and wire cut, the war does not pause. It narrows. The vast machinery of armies and fronts compresses into a single place where denial can no longer operate. What is about to be seen will force acknowledgement, not just by those present, but by the command structures that once hesitated. And once that threshold is crossed, there will be no return to abstraction. When American troops enter the camp, they do not do so as liberators in the cinematic sense history would later adopt. There is no cheering crowd, no raised fists. What greets them is silence, broken only by coughing and the sound of boots on frozen ground. The prisoners do not rush forward. Many cannot. Others wait, watching, measuring whether this moment is real. The physical reality is overwhelming. Barracks are unheated. Straw pallets are soaked with waste and melted snow. Food stores are non-existent or deliberately destroyed. Bodies lie where they fell, some inside the huts, others near the perimeter wire, caught mid-movement. Medics later report that many prisoners are beyond immediate help. Starvation has reached a point where refeeding itself becomes dangerous. The condition of the survivors tells a clear story. These are not prisoners recently captured. These are men who have been held for months, in some cases years, worked until collapse, then kept alive just long enough to continue. Numbers are recorded. Nationalities are identified where possible. Polish, French, Soviet, and other Allied prisoners appear alongside civilians forced into labor. The camp is not a battlefield improvisation. It is part of a system. Orders issued earlier are carried out with grim efficiency. Guards, if found, are detained. Medical triage begins immediately. Army photographers document everything: barracks interiors, bodies, tools used for labor, burial sites. Officers take statements from prisoners who can still speak. Each detail is logged because there is an understanding now that disbelief will follow discovery unless the record is unassailable. Patton himself does not linger at the site for long. His role is not to witness every detail, but to ensure the machine of the Army does not turn away. His staff coordinates with corps-level medical units and civil affairs officers. Supplies are rerouted. The camp becomes a fixed point on operational maps, no longer a footnote. What changes in this moment is not just the status of the prisoners. It is the status of truth. The existence of the camp can no longer be denied. It has coordinates, photographs, reports stamped and filed. The hesitation that once protected operational momentum now collapses under the weight of evidence. The advance resumes soon after, but it does so altered. Units move forward carrying with them the knowledge of what was left behind, and what will now be found again and again as the front continues east. That realization flows directly into what follows. The immediate and long-term consequences of acknowledging what the war has uncovered, and how those consequences reshape priorities far beyond this single site. The immediate aftermath unfolds with clinical urgency rather than celebration. Liberation is only the first step, and it proves to be the simplest one. What follows is logistics under strain. Medical officers quickly realize that traditional treatment protocols do not apply. Many prisoners cannot digest standard rations. Some die after eating too much, too quickly. Starvation has altered their bodies beyond normal recovery timelines. Field hospitals are overwhelmed. Tents fill with men whose weights are recorded not in pounds lost, but in pounds remaining. Typhus and dysentery are constant threats. Strict quarantine measures are imposed, not to isolate the liberated from compassion, but to prevent disease from spreading through already exhausted American units and nearby civilian populations. Guards are posted not to confine, but to protect both the prisoners and the fragile medical perimeter around them. Reports move rapidly now. What had once stalled in channels of verification is transmitted upward with urgency. Corps and Army headquarters forward documentation to higher Allied command. Photographs, medical assessments, and sworn statements accompany the reports. The tone changes. Where earlier messages had been cautious, these are unequivocal. The camps exist. Their conditions are undeniable. Their discovery is not anomalous. It is representative. This shift triggers action beyond the immediate site. Civil affairs units are alerted. Plans are adjusted to prepare for additional discoveries. Medical supply priorities change. Commanders are instructed to expect similar conditions as they advance. The war's humanitarian dimension, long acknowledged in theory, is now operational reality. For the soldiers involved, the impact is personal and lasting. Many write home, struggling to describe what they have seen without language strong enough to convey it. Combat no longer feels like the most brutal aspect of the war. The enemy is no longer just armed resistance, but the evidence of what resistance defended. The camp itself becomes a reference point, not a symbol yet, that will come later, but a documented fact that reshapes expectations. The Army does not slow its advance, but it no longer pretends that speed alone defines success. The encounter has introduced a new measure of victory: exposure. That exposure will carry consequences well beyond medical care and immediate relief, shaping how the war is understood, recorded, and ultimately judged in its final months. As the advance continues, the discovery no longer stand alone. Similar sites appear across the path of Allied forces, each reinforcing the reality first confronted by Third Army units. The pattern is unmistakable. Camps vary in size and structure, but the conditions repeat with grim consistency. Starvation, forced labor, hasty evacuations, mass graves concealed beneath thin layers of soil. What changes is the response. Commanders no longer hesitate to divert resources. Procedures are standardized. Units are instructed to secure sites immediately, preserve evidence, and notify civil affairs and medical teams without delay. The early uncertainty, whether such places truly existed in the path of the advance, vanishes. The question is no longer if, but where. At higher levels of command, the documentation gathered by Patton's army and others begins to shape policy. Allied leaders recognize that these discoveries will define the war's moral legacy. Orders are issued to ensure camps are not merely liberated, but recorded with precision. Photographers and journalists are embedded. Medical findings are preserved. The evidence is intended not only for immediate relief, but for future reckoning. For George S. Patton, the episode reinforces a long-held belief about leadership. His writings in the months that follow reflect anger more than sorrow, not at the existence of the camps, which he sees as an extension of the enemy's character, but at the initial reluctance to believe reports from the front. To him, denial is not a failure of intelligence, but of imagination and will. Strategically, the war accelerates toward its conclusion. German resistance continues to collapse. The Rhine is crossed. Cities fall. Yet the psychological terrain has shifted. The enemy is no longer perceived solely as a defeated military force, but as the architect of a system whose exposure demands accountability. By the time the war ends, the camps discovered during these final months become central to how victory is defined. They strip away any remaining ambiguity about what was at stake. Liberation is no longer framed only as territorial gain, but as the interruption of an industrialized crime. This understanding settles slowly, unevenly, and with discomfort. It leaves behind questions about what was known, what was believed, and what was dismissed until evidence forced action. Those questions linger beyond the battlefield, shaping memory, judgment, and the responsibility carried forward by those who witnessed the moment when denial finally gave way to truth. The moment when Patton said, "We're getting them out," did not alter the outcome of the war in any measurable tactical sense. Armies would still advance. Germany would still fall. The maps would be redrawn exactly as planned. Yet history is shaped not only by outcomes, but by decisions made when certainty is inconvenient. What this episode reveals is not a contradiction in modern warfare, but its cost. Industrial war trains institutions to value efficiency, verification, and momentum. Those instincts are necessary. They win campaigns, but they also create blind spots where human suffering can be delayed, denied, or deprioritized until it becomes impossible to ignore. Patton's response was not an act of compassion in the sentimental sense. It was an assertion that command authority carries moral weight, whether acknowledged or not. By acting when denial was still possible, he forced recognition by his army, by higher command, and by history itself. The camps liberated in those winter months stand as evidence of what happens when systems collapse faster than conscience can keep up. They also stand as proof that individual decisions, made within vast institutions, still matter. In war, victory is often measured by ground taken and enemies defeated. But there are moments, rare, uncomfortable, and irreversible, when victory is measured by refusing to look away.